The only thing stranger than being accused of not belonging somewhere is being accused on land your family has owned for generations. The fresh smell of paint drifted through the warm afternoon air as Harrison Cole carefully moved his brush along the wooden fence that bordered the front yard. The old house behind him stood quietly beneath a bright blue sky, its white exterior showing signs of age but still carrying the pride of decades of family history. A large oak tree stretched over part of the property, casting moving shadows across the grass as a gentle breeze rolled through the neighborhood. Harrison stepped back to examine his work. The fence was beginning to look new again. That mattered to him. Every board, every nail, every inch of the property carried memories. He wiped a small streak of paint from his hand and reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around an old brass key. The metal was worn smooth from years of use. For a brief moment he looked at it, then slipped it back into his pocket without saying a word. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. Harrison turned toward the street just as a police cruiser slowed to a stop in front of the property. Several nearby neighbors glanced up from their yards. One woman paused while watering flowers. A man across the street lowered his newspaper. Curiosity traveled through the neighborhood almost instantly. Officer Derek Lawson stepped out of the cruiser and adjusted his uniform. His expression suggested he had already made up his mind about something. Harrison rested the paintbrush on the edge of the bucket and waited. Derek walked through the open gate and stopped a few feet away. "Sir, I need you to step away from the property." Harrison blinked once. "I am sorry." Derek pointed toward the house. "I received a report about someone entering this property without permission." Harrison looked at the house, then at the fence, then back at Derek. The response seemed so unexpected that for a second he thought he might have misunderstood. "Without permission?" he asked calmly. "That is correct." The officer folded his arms. "I am going to need you to leave the premises while we sort this out." Harrison did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked across the yard again. The afternoon sunlight reflected from the windows of the old house. A faint smile touched his face before disappearing. That reaction confused Derek immediately. Most people would have protested. Most people would have started explaining themselves. Harrison did neither. Instead, he quietly set the paintbrush down and brushed dust from his jeans. Across the street, more neighbors had started watching. Someone pulled out a phone. Another person stepped onto a porch for a better view. The small gathering grew with every passing minute. Derek noticed the attention and straightened his posture. "Sir, did you hear what I said?" Harrison nodded. "I heard you. Then why are you still standing here?" Harrison looked toward the front door of the house. His eyes lingered there for a moment longer than expected. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and wrapped his hand around the old brass key once more. "Because," he said quietly, "I have been standing here longer than most people can imagine." Officer Derek Lawson stared at Harrison Cole for several seconds, waiting for an explanation that never came. The answer he had just received sounded less like a response and more like a riddle. Around them, the quiet neighborhood was no longer quiet. Curtains shifted behind windows. Front doors opened. More neighbors stepped outside. What had started as a routine afternoon was becoming the most interesting thing on the block. Harrison remained standing beside the half-painted fence, calm and composed. The paintbrush rested on the edge of the bucket exactly where he had left it. Nothing about his posture suggested panic. Nothing about his expression suggested urgency. If anything, he seemed strangely comfortable. Derek found that unsettling. Most people accused of being somewhere they did not belong immediately tried to prove themselves. They reached for identification. They offered explanations. They pointed fingers. Harrison did none of those things. Instead, he looked toward the old house again. The afternoon sun reflected softly from the glass of the front windows. For a brief moment, his attention seemed completely detached from the conversation, as if the house mattered more than anything Derek was saying. "Sir," Derek said, his voice firmer now, "I need to know why you are on this property." Harrison slowly turned back toward him. "I am working on the fence." Derek frowned. "That is obvious." Harrison nodded politely. "Then you already know why I am here." Several people nearby exchanged amused looks. The answer was respectful, but it somehow made Derek feel even less certain about the situation. Across the street, a woman carrying groceries stopped beside her mailbox and began watching openly. Another neighbor quietly lifted a phone and started recording. Harrison noticed neither. Or perhaps he noticed, and simply did not care. He bent down and adjusted the lid on the paint can before standing upright again. The movement felt natural, familiar, like someone tending to something he knew intimately. Derek watched carefully. "Do you have any identification?" Harrison looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket. Derek expected a wallet. Instead, Harrison pulled out the same old brass key. The metal caught the sunlight. Years of wear had softened its edges. It looked older than the house itself. Harrison turned it slowly between his fingers before slipping it back into his pocket. "That is not identification," Derek said. "No." Harrison's eyes returned briefly to the front door. "But it is important." The answer only deepened the mystery. Derek followed Harrison's gaze toward the house. It was an ordinary property by most standards. Weathered but beautiful. Modest but well-maintained. Yet something about the way Harrison looked at it suggested a connection that could not easily be explained. The officer checked the address on his notepad again. Everything still pointed in the same direction. A complaint had been made. Concerns had been reported. Procedures had been followed. And yet the man standing before him seemed completely unbothered by all of it. A light breeze moved through the oak tree overhead. Leaves drifted slowly across the yard. Harrison watched them fall. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. Derek noticed immediately. "What is so funny?" Harrison shook his head. "Nothing. You keep smiling." Harrison looked toward the front porch one more time. "I was just remembering something my father used to say." Derek folded his arms. "And what was that?" Harrison's eyes lingered on the old front door. "He said a house remembers who loves it." The neighborhood grew strangely quiet after that. Even the people recording seemed unsure what to make of the man standing in the yard. And for the first time since arriving, Derek began to wonder if there was something about this property that nobody had bothered to tell him. Officer Derek Lawson glanced once more at the address written on his notepad. The numbers matched the mailbox. The mailbox matched the property report. Everything appeared straightforward on paper. Yet the man standing in front of him continued turning a simple situation into something strangely complicated. Harrison Cole remained beside the fence, calm as ever. The bucket of white paint sat near his feet. The afternoon sun drifted lower, bathing the yard in warm light. Across the neighborhood, more people had gathered. Some stood on porches. Others watched from sidewalks. A few continued recording. Nobody seemed eager to leave. They all sensed there was more to the story than anyone understood. Derek looked toward the house again. It was impossible to ignore how naturally Harrison moved around the property. He never hesitated when crossing the yard. He never looked lost. He never behaved like someone visiting for the first time. Every glance seemed familiar. Every movement seemed practiced. It was as though he knew every board in the fence and every crack in the walkway. "When was the last time you were here?" Derek asked. Harrison's eyes drifted toward the front porch. "A few days ago." "And before that?" Harrison smiled faintly. "Most of my life." The answer immediately drew reactions from several neighbors. A man standing near the curb frowned. An elderly woman across the street tilted her head as though trying to remember something. Derek noticed both reactions. "Most of your life?" he repeated. Harrison nodded. "I learned to ride a bicycle in this driveway." His gaze shifted toward a patch of concrete near the garage. "I planted that rose bush with my mother." Then he pointed toward the oak tree. "My father hung a tire swing from that branch when I was 9 years old." The details arrived so naturally that even Derek found himself looking where Harrison pointed. For a brief second, the stories felt real enough to picture. A young boy running across the yard. A family gathered beneath the tree. Summer afternoons that existed long before this conversation. Yet Derek quickly reminded himself that memories proved nothing. Anyone could tell a story. "Interesting," he said carefully. "But stories do not establish ownership." Harrison did not argue. He simply nodded. "That is true." Then he reached into his pocket once more and wrapped his fingers around the old brass key. He did not remove it this time. He merely held it. The gesture caught Derek's attention immediately. The key appeared important. More important than identification. More important than the questions being asked. That alone made no sense. Across the street, the elderly woman suddenly stepped off her porch. She moved slowly but deliberately toward the sidewalk bordering the property. Her eyes remained fixed on Harrison. For a moment, it looked as though she wanted to say something. Instead, she stopped and remained silent. Harrison noticed her. A warm smile appeared on his face. The woman smiled back. It lasted only a second, but Derek saw it. And that brief exchange created a new question. If Harrison truly did not belong here, why did that look feel like recognition? The breeze stirred the leaves again. Somewhere in the distance, a vehicle turned onto the street. Harrison glanced toward the road, then toward the old house. His expression softened, almost as if he knew something important was about to arrive. The distant vehicle continued moving slowly toward the neighborhood, its engine barely audible beneath the rustling leaves. Harrison Cole watched the road for only a moment before turning his attention back to the old house. The sight of it seemed to calm him. The weathered porch, the faded shutters, the oak tree standing guard over the yard. To everyone else, it was simply another aging home on a quiet street. To Harrison, it was something much more. Officer Derek Lawson noticed the look immediately. The man standing before him was acting less like a visitor and more like someone reconnecting with a part of himself. Yet Derek remained convinced that procedures mattered more than impressions. Facts mattered. Documentation mattered. And so far, he had not seen any proof that Harrison belonged there. "Sir," Derek said, maintaining his firm tone, "I am giving you another opportunity to explain why you are on this property." Harrison glanced toward the fence he had been painting. The fresh white paint gleamed in the afternoon sun. "I think I already have." Derek sighed. "No. You have told stories. You have pointed at trees and fences. You have talked about memories." Harrison nodded. "Those things matter. Not when ownership is being questioned." For the first time, a faint shadow crossed Harrison's expression. Not anger. Not frustration. Something closer to disappointment. He looked toward the front door again. His hand slipped into his pocket and found the brass key. The familiar weight seemed to steady him. Across the street, the elderly woman remained standing near the sidewalk. Her eyes never left Harrison. A few more neighbors had gathered beside her. Quiet conversations moved through the crowd. Some seemed convinced Harrison was hiding something. Others looked increasingly uncertain. The longer the situation continued, the harder it became to fit Harrison into the role people had assigned him. He simply did not act the way they expected. Derek stepped closer. "If you belong here, then why not make this simple?" Harrison looked at him. "Simple. Show documentation." Harrison smiled slightly. Sometimes the truth is already standing right in front of people. The answer frustrated Derek. Around them, several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. Harrison seemed to be speaking in riddles again. Yet there was no arrogance in his voice. Only patience. The kind of patience someone develops after carrying a secret for a very long time. The vehicle approaching from the far end of the street finally turned onto their block. Several people glanced in its direction. It was not remarkable, just a sedan. Yet Harrison's eyes followed it briefly before returning to the house. Derek noticed. "Are you waiting for someone?" Harrison thought about the question. Then he nodded once. "Maybe." "Who?" Harrison looked toward the front porch. "Someone who remembers." The response only deepened the mystery. The sedan continued approaching. Meanwhile, the afternoon light shifted lower across the yard. Golden sunlight illuminated the old brass numbers mounted beside the front door. Harrison noticed them and smiled. His gaze lingered there for several seconds. Derek followed his eyes. The numbers meant nothing to him, just an address. But to Harrison, they seemed to carry meaning, memory, history, something larger than the moment unfolding around them. The crowd sensed it too. The atmosphere had changed. What began as suspicion was slowly becoming curiosity. And standing at the center of it all, Harrison remained calm, holding on to a secret that appeared to grow more important with every passing minute. The sedan finally slowed as it approached the property, and for a brief moment, every person watching seemed to hold their breath. Harrison Cole followed the vehicle with his eyes, but made no effort to wave it down. He simply stood beside the freshly painted fence with one hand resting near the pocket that held the old brass key. The neighborhood had become unusually still. Even the conversations that had been drifting through the crowd were fading away. Officer Derek Lawson noticed the shift immediately. People were no longer paying attention to him. They were watching Harrison, waiting to see what would happen next. The realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He glanced once more at the house. The longer he stood there, the more details he noticed. The porch railings had been recently repaired. The flower beds had been cleared of weeds. The fence was halfway through a fresh coat of paint. None of it looked abandoned. None of it looked neglected. It looked cared for. Harrison looked at the property the way people looked at family photographs. There was history in his eyes every time he turned toward the house. Derek folded his arms. You still have not given me a reason to believe you belong here. Harrison looked toward the oak tree again. The afternoon light filtered through the leaves, scattering moving patterns across the yard. Maybe that is because you are looking for the wrong kind of proof. Derek shook his head. Proof is proof. Harrison smiled faintly. Not always. Across the street, the elderly woman finally stepped closer. Her name was Margaret Benson, and she had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else. She studied Harrison carefully. The longer she looked, the more her expression changed. Confusion slowly gave way to recognition. Excuse me, she said softly. The crowd immediately turned toward her. Harrison looked at her and smiled politely. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. You remind me of someone. Harrison nodded. I get that a lot. Derek watched the exchange carefully. Do you know him? Margaret hesitated. I am not sure. Her gaze drifted toward the house. But there is something familiar about him. The answer only increased the tension. Harrison remained calm. He never rushed to explain. He never volunteered information. It was almost as though he was allowing the truth to arrive at its own pace. The sedan came to a stop near the curb. The driver remained inside for a moment. Several people turned to look. Harrison did not. Instead, he pulled the brass key from his pocket and looked at it again. Sunlight reflected from the worn metal surface. Years of history seemed trapped inside that small object. Derek noticed. You keep looking at that key. Harrison closed his hand around it. Because it reminds me who I am. The answer lingered in the air. Nobody knew exactly what it meant, but everyone felt its importance. Then the driver's door of the sedan opened. A woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Harrison finally looked toward the street. For the first time all afternoon, the faint smile on his face became a little larger. And the moment Derek saw that smile, he realized the entire situation was about to change. The woman closed the car door and stood quietly beside the sedan for a moment, holding the leather portfolio against her side. The late afternoon sunlight caught the edge of the folder as she looked toward the old house. Unlike everyone else gathered along the street, she did not seem interested in the crowd. Her attention moved immediately to Harrison Cole. A look of recognition crossed her face. Not surprise, not uncertainty, recognition. Harrison slipped the brass key back into his pocket and watched her approach. Around them, the neighborhood had fallen almost completely silent. Even the people recording with their phones seemed reluctant to speak. Something about the woman's arrival felt important. Officer Derek Lawson noticed it as well. He stepped slightly forward, maintaining his professional posture. Ma'am, he said, can I help you? The woman smiled politely, but kept walking toward the property. I believe I am exactly where I need to be. The answer caused several people to exchange confused looks. Harrison's faint smile remained. As the woman reached the front gate, she stopped and looked around the yard. Her eyes moved across the newly painted fence, the flower beds, the oak tree, and finally the house itself. For a brief moment, she seemed lost in memory. It still looks the same, she said softly. Harrison nodded. That was the goal. The woman laughed quietly. Your father would have liked that. The words landed with immediate weight. Several heads turned toward Harrison. Derek's expression tightened. This was the first person all afternoon who appeared to know something specific about him. Harrison looked toward the house again. He always said the place deserved another chance. The woman nodded. I remember. Derek stepped closer. Excuse me, but who are you? The woman finally turned toward him. My name is Emily Turner. She extended a hand. County Property Records Department. A murmur moved through the crowd. The title alone changed the atmosphere. Derek shook her hand. Property records? Emily glanced at the leather portfolio. Yes. Then she looked toward Harrison. Mr. Cole asked me to verify a historical file. Harrison said nothing. He simply watched the sunlight drift. Across the front porch, Emily opened the portfolio slightly and checked several documents inside. The movement instantly drew everyone's attention. Yet she did not remove anything. Not yet. Instead, she looked around the neighborhood. This street has changed. Harrison smiled. Not as much as people think. The elderly woman named Margaret suddenly stepped forward. I knew I recognized him. Everyone turned toward her. Margaret's eyes filled with emotion as she looked at Harrison. You are James Cole's son. Harrison's smile widened. Yes, ma'am. The crowd reacted immediately. Some neighbors looked surprised. Others looked embarrassed. Margaret pointed toward the oak tree. I remember when your father planted that tree. Harrison glanced toward the massive branches overhead. I remember helping him water it. For the first time all afternoon, Derek felt certainty beginning to slip away. Too many details were connecting. Too many people seemed to recognize Harrison. The simple explanation he arrived with no longer felt simple at all. Emily closed the portfolio and looked directly at him. Officer Lawson, she said calmly, before this goes any further, there is probably something you should see. Officer Derek Lawson looked from Emily Turner to Harrison Cole and back again. The confidence that had carried him through most of the afternoon was gone now. In its place was a growing sense that he had stepped into a story long before understanding any of its history. The crowd felt it too. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The neighborhood seemed suspended in the golden light of late afternoon. Emily carefully opened the leather portfolio and removed a thick folder secured with a county record seal. The simple sight of official documents immediately drew everyone's attention. Harrison remained quiet. His hands rested comfortably at his sides. The old brass key remained tucked inside his pocket. He looked less interested in the folder than anyone else present. Derek noticed that detail immediately. Most people would have been anxious. Most people would have stared at the paperwork waiting for validation. Harrison seemed completely unconcerned. It was almost as though he already knew every word inside. Emily flipped through several pages before stopping. These records go back decades, she said calmly. Some of them are older than I am. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Margaret Benson stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the documents. Emily continued turning pages. Property maps, tax records, transfer documents, historical filings. The folder appeared far larger than anyone expected. Derek felt his stomach tighten. This was becoming much bigger than a simple complaint call. Finally, Emily paused on a particular page. She studied it for a moment before looking directly at Harrison. I found exactly what you asked me to locate. Harrison nodded once. I thought you would. Emily smiled. Your father kept remarkable records. The mention of his father once again changed the atmosphere. Several people in the crowd were beginning to remember things. Old conversations, former neighbors, a family that once seemed woven into the identity of the entire street. Derek looked around and noticed it happening in real time. Faces were changing. Assumptions were beginning to crumble. Emily held up one document. This property has remained connected to the same family line for generations. She glanced toward Harrison. There has never been a legal interruption in ownership. A murmur spread through the crowd. Derek felt his pulse quicken. He looked toward Harrison, expecting some kind of reaction. There was none, just the same calm expression he had worn all day. Emily closed the folder halfway and turned toward Derek. Before I continue, there is one thing we need to confirm. Derek nodded slowly. What is that? Emily looked toward Harrison. For the first time all afternoon, every eye on the street followed her gaze. Even the breeze seemed to fade away. Harrison understood immediately. The moment had arrived. The secret he had carried quietly through hours of suspicion was finally standing at the edge of daylight. Emily spoke carefully. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full legal name? The neighborhood fell silent. Harrison slipped his hand into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the old brass key. Then he lifted his eyes toward the house one more time. The sunlight illuminated the front porch, the oak tree, and the freshly painted fence. A faint smile touched his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and certain. My name is Harrison James Cole. The moment the words left his mouth, Emily looked down at the document in her hands, and Officer Derek Lawson felt every remaining piece of certainty begin to disappear. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire neighborhood seemed frozen beneath the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Emily Turner lowered her eyes to the document in her hands. Then she read the name again, slowly, carefully, as though allowing everyone around her to absorb what it meant. Harrison James Cole. The words matched perfectly. Every letter, every detail, every record. Emily looked up and nodded. That is the name listed here. A murmur swept through the crowd. Some people exchanged startled glances. Others simply stared at Harrison. Officer Derek Lawson felt the ground beneath his assumptions begin to disappear. Emily opened the folder wider and revealed several additional pages. Not only is Mr. Cole listed as the legal owner of this property, she said, He is also the sole heir to the original family trust that has held this land for generations. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all afternoon. Derek looked toward the old house, then toward Harrison, then back to the documents. The pieces were finally connecting. The stories about the tree, the memories about the driveway, the familiarity with every corner of the property. None of it had been an act. Harrison had never been explaining himself. He had simply been telling the truth. Margaret Benson wiped at the corner of one eye and smiled softly. I knew I remembered that face. Harrison returned the smile. You used to bring cookies over every Christmas. Margaret laughed through her emotion. Your father always ate too many of them. Several neighbors smiled for the first time all afternoon. The atmosphere was changing rapidly now. Suspicion was being replaced by understanding. Emily carefully turned another page. The records show that the home was transferred directly from James Cole to Harrison James Cole under a fully documented estate plan. She looked toward Derek. There has never been any legal question regarding ownership. Derek swallowed hard. Every word felt heavier than the last. He looked toward Harrison, expecting anger, resentment, some sign of vindication. Instead, Harrison simply stood beside the fence, calm as ever. The same calm he had carried from the beginning. The same calm nobody had understood. Emily closed the folder. Mr. Cole requested copies of several historical records because he is restoring the property. Harrison nodded. My father always wanted the house preserved. The sunlight drifted across the front porch as he spoke. For a moment his attention returned to the home itself. Not the crowd. Not the officer. The house. The place that held his family's history. Derek finally stepped forward. His voice was quieter now. Mr. Cole. Harrison looked at him. The neighborhood waited. Derek glanced toward the freshly painted fence and lowered his eyes briefly. I should have listened more carefully. Harrison studied him for a second. Then he nodded. Not triumphantly. Not smugly. Simply acknowledging the truth. The response seemed to surprise Derek even more. There was no desire to embarrass him. No attempt to make the moment worse. Only dignity. Emily slipped the documents back into the portfolio. Around them, people slowly began putting away their phones. The story they thought they were watching had ended. A very different story had taken its place. And standing in the center of it all was a man who never needed to prove who he was because the truth had been there from the very beginning. The crowd began to thin as the afternoon slowly gave way to evening. One by one, neighbors returned to their homes. Phones disappeared into pockets. Conversations faded into the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. The excitement that had drawn everyone to the street was over, replaced by something quieter. Reflection. Harrison Cole stood beside the freshly painted fence and watched the sunlight settle across the yard. The old house seemed different now, not because anything had changed, but because the truth was finally visible to everyone. Emily Turner carefully returned the documents to her portfolio. Before leaving, she looked toward Harrison and smiled. Your father would be proud. Harrison glanced at the front porch. For a moment, he could almost hear the familiar sound of his father's laughter carried by memory alone. I hope so, he said softly. Emily nodded and walked back toward her sedan. The engine started a few moments later, and the vehicle slowly disappeared down the street. Margaret Benson lingered near the sidewalk. She looked at the oak tree, then at Harrison. I remember when your father planted that thing, she said with a gentle laugh. Harrison smiled. He said it would outlive all of us. Margaret looked up at the massive branches stretching across the yard. Looks like he was right. After another brief conversation, she headed home as well. Soon the street grew quiet. Only one person remained standing near the property line. Officer Derek Lawson. The confidence that had accompanied him earlier was gone. He looked at the house differently now. Not as a location on a report. Not as an address attached to a complaint. As someone's home. Harrison noticed him standing there and walked closer. Neither man spoke immediately. The evening breeze moved through the leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. Life had returned to normal. Derek finally broke the silence. I made assumptions today. Harrison nodded. A lot of people did. Derek looked toward the freshly painted fence. You had every reason to be angry. Harrison slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out the old brass key. The worn metal caught the last rays of sunlight. He turned it slowly in his hand before answering. My father taught me something a long time ago. Derek waited. Harrison looked toward the front door. He said the truth does not need help being true. The words settled gently between them. Derek lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. There was nothing left to say. Harrison smiled politely and walked toward the front porch. The old wooden steps creaked beneath his boots. He reached the door and removed the brass key from his pocket. The same key he had carried all afternoon. The same key nobody understood. The key slid smoothly into the lock. One simple turn. The door opened. Warm evening light spilled across the entryway. Harrison paused for a moment before stepping inside. He looked back one final time. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze. The fence gleamed with fresh paint. The yard looked exactly as he remembered it. Home. Then he stepped through the doorway and quietly closed the door behind him. Outside, the last golden rays of sunlight touched the house that had belonged to the Cole family for generations, and for the first time in a very long time, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.